The whole fiasco started on a dreary Tuesday when I dropped off one of our most irritating clients at the airport. His constant griping all morning had worn me down, so I wasn't eager to rush back to the office. Instead, I decided to take a break. I pulled into a rundown bar and grill about a mile from the airport, figuring I could enjoy a slow lunch and a couple of beers before diving back into work. As I sat in a booth nursing my beer and pondering the elusive quest for a great burger, my attention was drawn to a couple who had just entered. They chose a booth across the room, sitting close together. The woman, a curvy blonde and a short skirt that flaunted her legs and a tight pink top, caught my eye. Her companion looked like he was trying too hard to be tough, dressed in skinny jeans and a black leather jacket. It soon became clear why this pair piqued my interest. The woman was Lori, my sister-in-law, and the man with her was definitely not my brother, Mark. It was obvious they were more than friends. As they ordered drinks, they immediately started making out in their booth. Shocked, I watched as the guy's hand slid under her skirt. Lori leaned back, sighing, clearly enjoying the attention. Confronting them wasn't a question. It was a certainty. The real issue was controlling my urge to lash out then and there. I never liked Lori. From the moment Mark started dating her, I sensed trouble. When he announced their engagement just 4 months into dating, my doubts only grew. Mark, at 23, was blindly in love. To him, Lori was perfect. But to me, she was shallow and selfish, not worthy of my brother's affection. He adored her, doing everything for her, and she basked in it. Surprisingly, their first 3 years of marriage seemed blissful. But seeing her now, tangled up with another man, suggested those happy days were over. The guy had his hand on Lori's waist, kissing her neck. She didn't notice me approach until I slid into their booth. Her eyes flew open, and her boyfriend quickly pulled away, glaring at me. Before he could react, I smiled and casually greeted Lori. Her face shifted from shock to horror as she registered who I was. I introduced myself to her companion as Tom, Lori's brother-in-law. His face went from startled to annoyed, but he didn't say a word. Lori babbled, trying to pass him off as an old friend. I smiled and mentioned how their relationship seemed a bit more than friendly. Jake, as she called him, mumbled an excuse and bolted from the restaurant, leaving Lori pale and trembling. I leaned back, anger simmering, and asked why Mark wasn't enough for her. She stammered, unable to form a coherent response. I laid it all out, questioning how long this had been going on and how many others there were. Lori grabbed my hand, begging me not to tell Mark. Her desperation was almost pitiful. Despite her pleas, I debated whether to tell Mark about his wife's betrayal. Lori was either too stunned or too naive to think straight. I pulled my hand away, pondering if I should expose her deceit. Her eyes were frantic, and she seemed to be grasping for something to say. Suddenly, Lori changed tactics, pleading for my silence and claiming that my own wife was cheating on me. I laughed at her desperate lie, but she insisted she was serious. According to her, my wife had been seeing someone from her health club for weeks. Despite knowing it was impossible, her certainty rattled me. My wife and I had been together for a decade, 7 years married. She was the most honest, devoted person I knew. Lori leaned in, saying the other woman had confided in her about the affair. I scrutinized her face, trying to process this new information. Despite Lori's initial terror, she now appeared calm, as if she were revealing a truth rather than spinning a desperate story. While I found it hard to believe given our history, I couldn't entirely dismiss her claim. The situation was surreal, and I felt torn between disbelief and the unsettling possibility that she might be right. My eyes drifted back to Lori, who seemed to be nervously anticipating my next move. Though I didn't show it, there was no way I could keep this from Mark. I needed to uncover the truth. I spoke slowly, hinting that we might find a solution. After some thought, I expressed my refusal to be deceived by Beth. I suggested to Lori that if she helped me gather evidence about Beth's actions, I wouldn't tell Mark about what I'd seen that afternoon. However, I made it clear she had to promise never to see Jake or any other man besides Mark again. Relief washed over her as she swore to comply. She asked, "You have my word on it?" I doubted the value of her word, but replied by asking what she would be willing to do to fulfill her part of the deal. I explained that I needed proof of Beth's infidelity. I proposed a plan. I would give Lori a tape recorder to hide in her apartment. She would invite Beth over, offer some wine, and engage in casual conversation, encouraging Beth to reveal details about her affair. I wanted to know who the man was, when and how the affair started, how often they met, and why she did it. As I laid out the plan, I found myself beginning to believe Lori's unusual story, which made me even angrier. Lori agreed to the plan, suggesting she could soften Beth up by sharing the details of my supposed affair, making it seem like a genuine heart-to-heart. I sarcastically asked if Jake was her only fling or if there were others. She quickly denied any others, but I remained skeptical. 20 minutes later, I was driving back to the office, my mind clouded with somber thoughts about the possible end of Mark's marriage and my own. My first instinct was to call Mark and tell him everything, but I knew it wasn't an option. I'd always been the steady older brother, while Mark was the charming, outgoing one. When he met Lori, he became a lovesick puppy within weeks, determined to marry her. Mark idolized Lori, believing she could do no wrong. Knowing his unwavering devotion, I realized he wouldn't believe me without solid proof. Despite my hope that Lori might be mistaken about Beth, the likelihood diminished as I considered her desperation. The possibility that she was lying to me out of panic crossed my mind, but I also had to prepare for the worst. When I arrived at the office, I jotted down steps I would need to take if the worst turned out to be true, things like credit cards, selling the house, and transferring car titles. That evening, when I got home, Beth was cheerfully humming in the kitchen as she set the table. She greeted me with a big hug and a kiss, appearing every bit the loving wife I was used to. Despite my suspicions, cultivated over 7 years of marriage, I knew I had to play the innocent husband a little longer. We chatted amicably during dinner, but when she mentioned her workout at the health club, I couldn't resist a bit of probing. I casually remarked on her dedication to working out, jokingly asking if the club was now offering free ice cream. She laughed, but I noticed a slight flush on her face. She explained she'd been enjoying the good feeling of a workout and coming home to her loving husband. She mentioned that a few weeks ago her black slacks had been tight, but now they fit perfectly. She beamed, and despite my concerns, I couldn't help but appreciate her beauty and my love for her. If she were truly cheating, I felt conflicted and unsure of how to proceed. Despite what the court calendar would later state, my marriage effectively ended exactly 1 week later on another Tuesday. Lori and I had arranged everything. I gave her a small tape recorder to hide in her living room, and she invited Beth over for lunch on her day off. Lori, who didn't have a job, kept me on edge throughout the afternoon, pretending to work while contemplating what the women might be discussing and how it could impact my life. At 430, Lori called to inform me they were done, and Beth had left. My heart sank as I asked if Beth had talked about the affair. Lori, sounding a bit tipsy, giggled and confirmed. She said Beth had confided about her lover, emphasizing he was a big guy. Feeling the tension, I realized I was gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. I agreed to drop by in 20 minutes. When I arrived at Lori's place, she handed me the tape recorder at the door, reminding me of my promise not to disclose anything. I assured her Mark wouldn't hear a word from me and stressed that Beth must never find out about the recording, as she might tell Mark out of anger. Nodding, I turned and left. That evening was one of the most painful of my life. Knowing I couldn't listen to the tape until Beth was asleep, I continued pretending to be the loving husband. Beth, still tipsy, shared that she'd spent the afternoon with Lori and had a lot of wine. She was feeling amorous and pulled me towards the bedroom, asking if I had something for her tonight in a flirtatious tone. I questioned whether I could or even wanted to go through with it, thinking it might be our last time together. Despite my turmoil, I followed her to the bedroom, but it wasn't lovemaking for me. My torn heart and worried mind overshadowed any pleasure. Afterwards, we lay in each other's arms and then repeated the act a few minutes later. Beth soon fell asleep, snoring gently. I retreated to the guest room, closed the door, and listened to the tape. The first few minutes of conversation between Lori and Beth were casual, with Lori keeping the wine flowing. Eventually, Lori confessed to Beth about her affair with Jake. It became obvious that Beth was already clued into the affair, and Lori was just spilling the juicy details to soften the blow. Lori played her role flawlessly, even laughingly admitting that Jake was just the latest in a line of guys. There had been a man named Ryan before, but he had moved out of town. Beth giggled and feigned shock, though she clearly enjoyed the tale. The sleazy specifics didn't faze me. I already knew what kind of person Lori was, and these details would only make it easier to prove to Mark that she had indeed cheated on him. I fought the urge to fast-forward the tape, anxiously waiting for what was to come. Lori soon shifted the topic to Andy, expressing curiosity about her experience. She giggled, noting that had only mentioned meeting him at the health club and his impressive endowment. My body tensed as I heard Beth's voice on the recording, laughing and describing Andy as the largest she had ever encountered. She shared more explicit details, doubting at first if he would fit inside her, leading to more laughter from both women. Overwhelmed by the revelations, I paused the tape and leaned back, absorbing the painful reality. My marriage was officially over. Did I even want to hear more? I thought about letting my lawyer handle it, but after a moment I turned the machine back on. It was time to face the full truth, confront my anger and pain, and start figuring out what my future would look like. Lori then asked Beth how the affair began. Beth explained that she never intended to cheat on me and felt awful about it. She talked about our happiness together and her disbelief at her actions. She attributed it to having a bad case of BTF, which she found amusing. Laughing, Beth promised to explain BTF after more wine. She continued, saying she had been going to the health club for years to stay fit and keep my interest. A few months ago, she noticed a new trainer named Tyler, describing him as hot with broad shoulders and impressive muscles. She mentioned his flirtatious behavior with women and recalled seeing him quietly chatting with Judy Hawthorne, a former colleague. Beth watched Judy enter Tyler's office, and later in the locker room, Judy appeared dazed and dreamy-eyed. She greeted Judy and noticed her happy demeanor. She told her she had a bad case of BTF, which she explained as big tool fever. Giggling, she recounted her experiences with Tyler, highlighting his impressive size and skills as a lover. Judy described how Tyler had flirted with her and eventually convinced her to go to his office, leading to a regular affair at the club. She gushed about how amazing he was, providing her with the wildest lovemaking she had ever experienced. While her story intrigued my wife, Beth had no plans to act on it, considering Judy's divorce status and her freedom to do as she pleased. Over the next few weeks, her curiosity about Tyler grew. She paid more attention when he flirted with her, brushing against her or touching her shoulder while helping with the machines. During one workout, as she did bench presses in a nearly empty area, he stood behind her to spot her. Looking up, Beth saw his shorts above her head, and the size of his bulge stunned her. He smiled, aware of her gaze. She nearly dropped the bar but managed to finish. As Beth racked the bar, he took her hand and slid it over his shorts. His tool felt massive and rock hard. After a few minutes, he pulled her to her feet, checked that no one was around, and led my wife to his office. Dazed, she followed. He locked the door, sat her down, and without a word removed his shorts. Standing before her, they had wild, passionate love-making. By the time he finished, she was exhausted and spent. Lori reacted with an impressed wow, genuinely amazed. She assumed Beth had continued seeing Tyler. Beth explained that after the encounter in Tyler's office, she showered, feeling dreamy and weak-kneed. Overwhelmed by guilt, she cleaned up and went home, terrified I would find out. Surprisingly, I didn't suspect anything that night, and everything seemed normal. Despite my desire for closeness, she made excuses, fearing I might notice a different appearance. The next night, she gave me the full treatment, engaging until I couldn't continue. Beth admitted she avoided the gym for 2 weeks after the incident, knowing she couldn't resist Tyler. Finally, she convinced herself it was a one-time thing. She was a grown woman with a wonderful husband and could resist temptation. So she returned to the gym. The first couple of times, Tyler winked and flirted but left her alone. She thought she was over it and relaxed. Then, about a week later, he caught her at the bench again. The room was empty and he got her hand on his tool. In no time, they were back in his office. Lori finished the sentence, commenting on how much better it must have been. Beth, speaking dreamily, struggled to describe the experience. She emphasized her deep love for our intimacy and confessed she had never been tempted to stray before. Even with a flirtatious coworker named Alex, despite his success with other girls, with Tyler she felt an unprecedented pleasure. Giggling, Beth acknowledged the absurdity of sharing such details, clarifying that Tyler wasn't special as a person or lover, it was purely physical. She called it God's gift, making both women laugh. Listening, I felt anger surging through me. I sat through the rest of the tape, but there wasn't much more. After the second time, Beth gave up resisting. She saw him 2 to 3 times a week for nearly a month, with no sign of stopping. In fact, she said our lovemaking had improved, perhaps because her secret turned her on. It was clear that her BTF had overridden any guilt about betraying me. The love of her life, her husband of 7 years, the man who still valued our vows. I spent a long time contemplating my next steps, and it was around 2:30 a.m. when I finally crashed in the guest room. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing or sleeping next to Beth, let alone talking to her. I quietly slipped into the bedroom, grabbed clothes for the next day, and left without waking her. By 6:30 a.m., I was out the door, leaving behind a short, detached note. I tried not to give anything away, just mentioned that I had an early meeting, apologizing for not mentioning it earlier. The previous night, I had made 2 copies of the tape at the office. By 8:30, I was on the phone with my best friend from college, who worked at a law firm downtown. I asked for a favor, requesting a meeting with the toughest, most relentless divorce lawyer in his firm. There was a pause before he expressed his shock and apologized for my situation. After a brief conversation, Mike led me to the office of Laura Winslow, a senior partner in his firm known for her fierce demeanor. Mike had described her as someone even sharks would steer clear of. Laura's stern look and firm handshake reassured me that she meant business. I felt a bit of relief knowing she would be on my side, not Best. I played a part of the tape for Laura and Mike. After listening to the first few moments, Laura asked her assistant to hold all calls, and we continued listening to the rest of the recording. When it ended, there was a brief silence before Laura asked bluntly, "Okay, what do you want?" I told her I wanted a divorce due to infidelity, and I didn't want to use the generic term irreconcilable differences. I was willing to be fair about our savings, but I insisted on keeping the house. Additionally, I wanted Beth to revert to her maiden name because I felt she no longer deserved to be Mrs. Harris. Laura nodded thoughtfully, studying me for a moment before requesting a brief meeting with Mike to discuss the legal specifics. Within 5 minutes, I was back in her office, and she was ready to proceed. She assured me that the divorce would likely go smoothly, with Beth accepting the terms. However, she noted that the tape might be inadmissible in court since Beth was unaware of the recording. I frowned and explained the complication involving my sister-in-law Lori's infidelity, her offer to help, and the content of the first part of the tape. I planned to inform my brother, knowing it would devastate him. Half-jokingly, I suggested Laura consider handling my brother's divorce as well. She glanced at Mike before focusing back on me. We listened to Lori's part of the tape next. After another brief discussion with Mike, Laura commented, "Quite a pair of wives you two ended up with." Seeing my reaction, she quickly apologized for the inappropriate remark. Laura then laid out the situation, explaining that while the tape might not be admissible against Beth due to her unawareness, Lori could be subpoenaed to testify about what Beth had told her. She assured me that Beth's attorney wouldn't have much to counter with once he heard the tape. In Mark's case, the tape was admissible because Lori knew she was being recorded, leaving her with no defense. That divorce would be straightforward as long as Mark wasn't too unreasonable. Laura also mentioned the possibility of suing the health club in Tyler. Although Tyler probably didn't have much money, she and Mike could likely secure a significant settlement from the club. Potentially in the high 6 figures to over $1 million, the tape could be used in a civil lawsuit, and the club would certainly want to avoid the publicity of such a scandal. Laura laughed briefly, maintaining her intimidating demeanor, and assured me she would initiate the divorce proceedings immediately. Mike escorted me out, expressing his apologies again and assuring me that Laura would handle everything. Despite feeling terrible, I managed a weak smile and told him, "It's okay, Mike. This just means we'll have more time to play tennis together." I thanked him and left, diving into a whirlwind of tasks for the rest of the day. I arranged for a locksmith to change the locks at 430 and made a dinner date with Mark to avoid being home when Beth returned. I canceled her credit cards, set up separate accounts for our finances, and wrote her a farewell note. It took several attempts. It's not easy saying goodbye to the love of your life, even after such betrayal. Once I finished, I placed the note in an envelope, wrote Beth's name on the front, and took it home. The locksmith finished by around 5:15. I sat quietly in the kitchen, nursing a beer, then taped the note to the outside of the front door, locked up, and left. Beth would be home between 6 o'clock and 6:30. I wondered idly what she would do first. Try the door and find her key, didn't work, or read the note. Our marriage is over. Now you can be with Tyler and his big tool as much as you want. I've changed the locks. To collect your things, call my attorney. I left Laura's name and number. She will arrange supervised access to the house when I'm not there. I won't be speaking to you again. You broke my heart. I loved you as much as any man could love a woman and looked forward to growing old together. Too bad our marriage vows didn't mean as much to you as some love-making with a big tool. When Mark joined me for dinner, he immediately sensed something was wrong. After we ordered, I took a deep breath and told him about Beth's cheating and my plans to divorce her. His reaction was shock. His mouth hung open. Something I'd never seen before. "Oh my God, Tom. My God, Beth. Are you sure?" he asked, then quickly apologized for the stupid question. He could see the truth in my face and asked if I wanted to talk about it. I did. Over dinner, I poured out my hurt and despair to my best friend. The beers helped a bit, but having Mark's support meant even more. Towards the end of the meal, I revealed another part. There's something else I haven't told you. Lori got me the proof. She taped a conversation with Beth, who spilled everything. Mark looked at me with sympathy, expressing his sorrow. He added, "I hope this doesn't make you angry, but I feel lucky to have Lori. She's always liked you, and it doesn't surprise me she helped. I know you haven't always approved of her, but she's a good person." I couldn't stand hearing more praise for Lori, especially now. I interrupted. "Listen, Mark, wait. Don't say anything else. Let me pay the bill, and I need you to come back to the house with me." When we got to the house, I found a note with Tom, written on it, in flowery handwriting under the screen door. Without reading it, I dropped it on the hall table and ushered Mark into the guest room. I stressed the seriousness of this situation, expressing my love for him and our friendship. He looked wary, unused to such conversations. I urged him to listen to a tape recorded by Lori, telling him to stay seated while I went to another room to rewind the tape to the beginning. I pushed the tape recorder toward Mark and left the room. Moments later, I heard faint murmurs from the tape, followed by a loud crash. Mark, clearly agitated, paced around while the tape continued to play until it eventually fell silent. When I entered the kitchen, he confronted me with a look of intense anger. He accused me of taking pleasure in knowing about Lori's infidelity and keeping it from him on purpose. He berated me for letting him praise her without revealing the truth, insisting that I must be enjoying the situation because of my long-held dislike for Lori. I stood up and raised my voice, questioning how he could accuse me of such a thing when I had just discovered the truth myself. My glare intensified, and gradually Mark's anger seemed to dissipate. His shoulders slumped, his fists unclenched, and he sat down at the table looking defeated. After a moment, he apologized, saying, "Sorry, Tom, I know you're hurting just like I am. It's just you obviously knew about this. Why didn't you tell me?" "Mark," I said softly, "you know how you were about Lori. You would never have believed me. Remember that fight we had when I criticized something she'd said to Mom? I found out a week ago, and I knew I couldn't tell you. You had to hear it for yourself. I only got the tape from her yesterday." The two of us downed a few beers as I recounted the whole story to Mark. I began with seeing Lori and Jake at the restaurant, then explained the deal she offered me, the making of the tape, and my conversation with Laura Winslow. I mentioned that Laura was handling my divorce and would be happy to represent him too if he wanted. She said our cases were practically in the bag. We talked late into the night, and then Mark crashed in my guest room, unable to face Lori. The phone rang several times, but we ignored it, and eventually I just left it off the hook. Days turned into weeks, and Beth kept calling, leaving messages full of tears and pleas. But I didn't respond. I saw no point in talking to her. She tried to find me at work, but I asked the receptionist to tip me off, and I ducked out whenever she showed up. A few times I saw her car parked in front of the house when I got home, so I just drove around until she left. Laura handled everything flawlessly. The divorce papers were served, and she navigated through all the legal maneuvers Beth's lawyer attempted. A court date was set. Initially, Beth's lawyer claimed that no infidelity had occurred. Once Laura sent him a copy of the tape, that line of defense disappeared. Instead, he argued that the tape was inadmissible. Laura didn't even respond to that, just waited it out. As the court date approached, Beth's lawyer finally called Laura to request a settlement conference. The day after listening to the tape, Mark moved out of his apartment with Lori and into my guest room. He waited until she left, then called me. Together, we packed up everything he wanted and got out of there in under 2 hours. I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear a word she has to say. I just want to get away from her. He told me, his eyes welling up. I turned away, knowing exactly how he felt. Lori left me a couple of angry, curse-filled messages at home, a sharp contrast to Beth's remorseful ones. After a day or two, I started screening my messages, deleting any from Lori or Beth as soon as I heard their voices. Lori called Mark at work and sent him letters, but he never responded. Laura took care of his divorce as well, and we let her handle everything. Surprisingly, the lawsuits against Tyler and the health club were resolved quickly. The one against Tyler didn't go far. He disappeared without a trace. But the health club, eager to avoid bad publicity, reached a $1.1 million settlement. I signed a confidentiality agreement and walked away with the biggest check I'd ever seen. In less than 10 weeks, Mark and I had become each other's support system. We lived like two bachelors going out to eat, catching ball games, or just sitting around and talking over beers. We talked about Beth and Lori, about our lives with them, about the many great women out there just waiting for us. It wasn't easy to believe, but we helped each other. I could see clearly that there was nothing wrong with Mark that caused Lori's behavior. She was simply selfish. Likewise, Mark reassured me that Beth's cheating wasn't a reflection on me, just a sign of how messed up she was. Neither of us fully believed the other, but it still helped to hear it. Mark's divorce was finalized first. He made it clear he wouldn't talk to Lori under any circumstances, so Laura handled everything. She told him Lori had initially fought for more money, but with the tape, she had no leverage. I went to the office with him the day he signed the papers. Lori had already signed them. He gave a grim smile, shook Laura's hand, thanked her, and then went to the men's room. I heard him crying through the door when I went to check on him. 3 weeks later, it was my turn. We met on a Tuesday, me, Beth, and our lawyers. Beth's lawyer had agreed to a settlement, but insisted on 2 conditions: that I drop infidelity as the reason for the divorce, and that I meet privately with Beth before signing the papers. I told Laura I was willing to see Beth, but not willing to drop the infidelity claim. Eventually, we agreed that I'd give Beth a chance to persuade me. If she could, we'd change it to irreconcilable differences. In a strange way, I was looking forward to hearing what Beth had to say. Maybe I'm a masochist, but I had loved her for 10 years and couldn't imagine walking away without one final conversation. When I arrived, Beth was sitting in the conference room wearing a blue dress. She knew I'd always loved her hair, now shorter and still looking great. Despite her pale appearance, she was still the beautiful woman I had loved for so long. "All right, Beth, it's your meeting," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral even though my heart was pounding. "Just 2 things. Please don't tell me how much you love me, and don't say it was just sex." Her face flushed and tears filled her eyes. "Tom, I'm so sorry, but how can I not say those things? I messed up. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I hurt you. But it was just sex, a stupid, meaningless impulse. You can't imagine how many times I've wished I'd never done it." "Yes, well, but you did do it, didn't you?" I replied coldly. I had no intention of making this easy for her. Just being in the same room, knowing we were about to end everything for good and why, broke my heart all over again. I turned to the window, unwilling to let her see my pain. Behind me, I heard her sobbing softly. "Baby, it didn't mean anything. It was the dumbest, most hurtful thing I could ever have done. It meant nothing to me. It has nothing to do with how much I love you." I let her continue, hearing the pleading tone and the sweet voice I had once adored, but none of her words were surprising. She had nothing new to tell me, nothing that made any difference. After a while, I turned back to her and sat down across the table. And just so you know, I still love you very much, but it's over between us." She started to cry again. "You took from me, from us, the most precious thing we had besides our love, trust. How could I ever make love to you again, wondering if you were thinking about me or Tyler and his tool? How would I know if you were loving me or missing him? And how could I live with you, always wondering where you were, if you were late or what you were doing on your lunch break, or if you'd found another big tool to play with?" I waited, but she had no response. Finally, through her sobs, she said, "Please, baby, give me one more chance." I took a deep breath and said, "Think about this. What if I had found some woman with amazing assets and started sleeping with her for a few weeks? No one I cared about, just someone who gave me physical pleasure I didn't get from you. Then you found out, could you stay with me? Could you get past the hurt, the betrayal? Could you overcome the doubts about your own attractiveness and the fear that you weren't enough for me?" She looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. "I don't have to think about it. I've been thinking about it for weeks. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if it were the other way around?" The answer is no. I couldn't handle those feelings, so I'm asking you to do something I couldn't do, to be braver and stronger than I could ever be and give me a chance to make it up to you. A lifetime to show you how sorry I am and how much I love you. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us reflecting on what we had meant to each other and how we had come to this point. Slowly, I stood up, hating myself, and hating her for cheating and now for putting this burden on me. I don't know if I can't do it or won't do it, but I'm not that braver, stronger person you want me to be. Goodbye. I waited by the open door, giving her a chance for the last word. She had her head down, crying, and didn't say anything else. Laura was waiting for me down the hall, a surprisingly sympathetic look on her usually stern face. "Let her have irreconcilable differences," I growled. "It doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me." Mark and I sat at my kitchen table. We'd had a few drinks but weren't drunk. "Listen," I said, "I've made some plans." He nodded and I continued. "After the lawyer fees, I still have nearly $800,000 from the settlement. I've invested all but $50,000 in safe places, so there's a nice nest egg for when we're old. But the last 50 grand is for the Tom and Mark Harris Recovery Fund, and we're going to start spending it. I've rented us a 2-bedroom condo in Cancun for 4 weeks, starting in 2 weeks. Tell your office you're taking time off. We're going to be a couple of fun-loving bachelors, 2 cheerful divorces." He raised an eyebrow and I laughed. "No, not that kind of gay. Gay as in cheerful. We've done enough moping around. Cancun was a blast, or at least as much as it could be for 2 guys recovering from broken hearts. We got a lot of sun, played tennis, swam, and drank a lot, though we kept each other from going overboard. Each day we got tanner, fitter, and a little further from the nightmare we had been living. God bless my charismatic and charming brother. Despite what Lori did to his confidence, he got his groove back, and we had plenty of female company. His favorite move, and one that worked 75% of the time, was to spot 2 attractive women, drag me over to their table, smile, and say, "Pardon me, ladies, I'm sure you wouldn't be comfortable letting a stranger buy you a drink. So let me introduce my brother, Tom Harris." Then I'd have to step in and say, "Delighted to meet you both. This is my brother, Mark Harris." Then Mark would step back in with a flourish. Glad that's settled. "Now may we buy you a drink?" By that point, the women were usually smiling or laughing, and we often found ourselves with female company for the evening. Sometimes that companionship lasted until breakfast. The unattached women in Cancun were just as eager for fun as we were. Over those 4 weeks, I had maybe 6 different women in my bed, and I imagine Mark's number was even higher. Mostly, it was light-hearted fun. Laughter and pleasure without any strings attached. The first few times I made love to a woman, I was tentative, distracted by thoughts of Tyler and his enormous tool, even though both he and Beth were thousands of miles away. It was hard to compete with what I knew he had done to her, but the women didn't seem to notice, and being with someone new got easier each time. One-night stands may not be for everyone, but they were exactly what Mark and I needed. Only one woman stood out. Erin, a tall Irish redhead a year younger than me. We did the usual things, had drinks, laughed, went to dinner, danced, and then headed back to my place. She was attractive and responsive, as eager to be with me as I was to be with her. We had a great time, but something changed around 3 a.m. I woke up and just lay there. Aaron softly breathing beside me, thoughts of Beth and everything we had shared filled my head. Before I knew it, I was crying quietly. Aaron woke up, knelt beside me, and held me, saying, "Let it out, baby. It's okay." I was embarrassed, but couldn't stop. She kept soothing me, and finally, in response to her gentle urging, I told her the whole story. By the time I finished, the sun was rising. We shuffled into the kitchen, and I made breakfast while she shared her own story. She was also divorced, no cheating, just a husband who became increasingly distant and career-focused until there was nothing left of their marriage. She had been on her own for nearly 2 years. After breakfast, we found our way back to the bedroom without a word and made love. The night before had been fun and exciting, but this time was different. We looked into each other's eyes, murmured tenderly, and found a deeper connection. My one-night stand with Aaron turned into 4 wonderful nights. When she left that afternoon, my brother Mark seemed a bit worried about me, urging me to meet new ladies. He said it was time to move on. I acknowledged that Aaron was special. He agreed, saying he liked her too, but reminded me that she had gone home and we still had 10 more days to enjoy. He dragged me off to the tennis court, then the pool, and by that evening we were chatting with 2 secretaries from San Francisco on their first trip outside the United States. That night they slept in their own hotel room, but the next afternoon Karen joined me in my room for her first ever experience on foreign soil. 8 months had passed since Cancun. Mark had found a great apartment he liked, but we still spent a lot of time together. Just after we ordered dinner at a steak place we both liked, Mark leaned forward and quietly told me that 2 couples had just sat down across the room, and one of them was Beth with some guy. I appreciated the warning and, despite my pounding heart, waited a few seconds before casually turning to look. She had already spotted us and was staring steadily at me. I gave her a friendly, non-committal smile and a wave, and she smiled back. Then I forced myself to turn back to Mark and resume our conversation. He asked if it was the first time I'd seen her since the divorce, and I nodded. I admitted that I didn't expect to feel so shaken, but the surprise had something to do with it. I suggested we enjoy our dinner and not talk about what she was doing over there or how she looked. Mark agreed, launching into a funny story about a coworker who had been flirting with him for weeks. He wasn't interested in her, but was enjoying the game. While we sipped our coffees and casually watched the dancing couples, I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard that familiar voice asking how I was. Rising from my seat, I looked into Beth's eyes and greeted her. She suggested a dance for old time's sake, and I agreed. As we danced, memories flooded back, her warmth in my arms, her beauty, and the nostalgia for happier times. We talked about mundane topics like our jobs and the weather, eventually lapsing into silence, lost in the emotions of holding each other again. I reflected on the dances we had shared and realized those moments were now just memories. Toward the end of the dance, Beth pulled back to look into my eyes and asked how I was really doing. Despite not owing her any honesty, I decided to share my feelings. I told her I was doing all right. Some days were better than others. Seeing her that night and dancing together stirred powerful emotions I hadn't anticipated. Beth, with a serious expression, confessed she wasn't doing so well. She missed me every day, and being in my arms again had a profound effect on her. Unsure of how to respond, I stayed silent as the music ended. Beth hesitated to let go and shared a thought. Had I ever wondered if I made the right decision? I admitted I still thought about us all the time, but usually didn't get past wondering why I made the wrong decision. Later, when I dropped Mark off, he expressed concern about how I was handling everything. I reassured him, acknowledging the inevitability of such encounters in a small town. We confirmed our tennis plans for the next day, and I headed home.